Episode 4. Surface. The cab from O'Hare dropped her on Michigan Avenue at 4:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in late November. She'd been on 2 planes before this one, and before that she'd been in a white room in Arlington for 45 minutes going through an exit protocol that had the specific texture of an organization letting go of something it wasn't entirely comfortable letting go of. The white room had a table and 3 chairs and a woman named Vargas who worked in ICD personnel and who moved through the protocol with the efficiency of someone who ran this session twice a week. Forms, confirmation of dates, emergency contact procedures that were theoretical since Renn didn't have emergency contacts, but the forms required entries and Vargas had looked at the blank line and filled in an agency number without comment. 7 days. She'd been given 7 days. Vargas had said something at the end that Renn recognized as an attempt at warmth and couldn't fully parse because the warmth didn't have a referent. Enjoy yourself, or something in that register. The automatic language of an institution that has a concept of personal time. It applies uniformly regardless of whether the concept lands. Renn had said thank you and left. The ICD had a word for what she'd been given. She was still working out what she had. The wind off the lake was the first thing. It hit her before the cab door was fully open, coming from the northeast, damp and direct, the kind of wind that finds the gap between collar and skin and stays there. She paid in cash through the window, didn't wait for the receipt, and stood on the sidewalk while the cab merged back into the Michigan Avenue southbound lane and became part of the afternoon traffic. The hotel was a block south. 12 stories, brick facing the same color as a November sky if the sky were slightly redder, a green awning over the entrance that had been there long enough to lose its original shade. She went through the revolving door into a lobby with marble floors and potted plants, and a front desk staffed by 2 agents, one of whom was finishing a call, and one of whom looked at her bag and then at her. She paid cash for 7 nights under a cover she kept current out of operational habit rather than any current need. Harlan. The agent didn't ask about the cash. A lot of people paid cash. This was Chicago, and this was the kind of hotel where a certain number of guests paid cash, and the agents who worked the front desk of hotels like this one had long since stopped finding that notable. Room 714. South-facing window. She set her bag on the luggage rack and stood at the window looking at the lower buildings, and then the river gap, and then the buildings again, and beyond them somewhere the elevated tracks, though she couldn't see them from this angle. While she stood there, a brown line train ran through somewhere to the east, the sound arriving a second after the physical logic of it should have, compressed and slightly wrong in the November air. She didn't unpack. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands on her knees and looked at the carpet. It was 5:04 p.m. 7 days. The number had a shape she could hold but not do anything with. She'd had downtime between assignments before, but it had always been operational, transit hours, medical recovery, waiting for documentation to clear. The structure of the work had always been present even in its absences, the shape of the next thing visible from wherever she was standing. This was different. She didn't have precise language for what it was. The ICD had called it leave. That word had once meant something she could access. She was less sure it still did. The hotel room was a hotel room. She'd been in hundreds of them. They had the specific neutrality of spaces that are designed to belong to no one and to offer no friction. And usually she moved through that neutrality without noticing it because the work occupied the foreground and the room was just the container for the work. Now the room was the foreground. Beige walls. A desk with a lamp positioned slightly too far left to be useful. The television on the dresser. Outside the window, the low building south and the gap where the river was. At 5:45 p.m., she walked out of the hotel and went north on Michigan for 30 minutes without destination. The city at that hour was in the transition between the end of the workday and the beginning of the evening. The sidewalks cycling from suits and briefcases to coats and dinner plans. The restaurants on the side streets beginning to fill. She walked north past the Wrigley Building and the Tribune Tower and over the bridge where the river ran gray below, then turned back south. She was cold by the time she got to the hotel. That was fine. Cold was concrete and specific and didn't require examination. She ordered room service at 6 15 p.m. soup, bread. Ate at the desk watching the local news with the volume at 8, low enough that the words blurred into tone. A traffic incident on the Dan Ryan. A vote in city council about something zoning related. The anchor's voice had the practiced evenness of someone trained to make every category of information arrive at the same emotional temperature. She turned it off at 8:41 p.m., got into bed, and lay with her hands flat at her sides looking at the ceiling. The ceiling had no water stain. It was white and flat and had nothing to tell her. She lay with her hands at her sides and her breathing even, and she wasn't performing rest because there was no one to perform for, and she wasn't asleep, and there was nothing to plan. She lay there with the specific vacancy of someone who has been so accustomed to filling the hours with purpose that the absence of purpose doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a variable that hasn't been resolved yet. Sleep arrived somewhere around 9:00 p.m. and she didn't fight it. She woke at 5:51 a.m. to gray light through the gap in the curtains and lay still for a moment longer than she needed to before she understood there was nothing requiring her to be ready. Day 2. She found the diner on Wabash on the walk south from the hotel, a block and a half past the parking garage, wedged between a dry cleaner and a phone repair shop in a building that had survived 3 rounds of street-level renovation by simply not participating in them. Formica counter, 8 stools, 4 tables against the window. The window ran the length of the room and looked out on the elevated structure, and every few minutes a train moved through and the light in the room shifted briefly in quality. The coffee came in ceramic mugs, white not paper, and the server, a woman in her 50s, dark hair pulled back, the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this job long enough to make it look like no effort at all, refilled without asking. Renn sat at the counter at 7:12 a.m., 2 businessmen at the far end working through breakfast fast, folders open beside their plates. A woman at the middle table with a phone and a half-eaten egg sandwich. Renn drank her coffee and watched the street through the window. A city bus stopped, took on 3 people, moved on. 2 men in matching jackets from a building services company stood outside the parking garage talking, neither of them seeming to have anywhere to be particularly soon. A man came in at 7:28 a.m. and took the stool 2 down from her. Work jacket, the specific canvas and flannel combination of a tradesman rather than an office worker. He was in his mid-40s. He had the look of someone who'd been awake since 5:00 a.m. Not because he'd slept badly, but because that was just when he woke up. He looked at the menu for the same amount of time it would take to confirm an order he'd already decided on before walking in. He ordered eggs and toast. The server wrote nothing, moved away. When she came back to refill his coffee, he started talking. His daughter had a school play that evening. She was in 6th grade. She was playing a tree. He said it straight and without apology, the way you say something that is what it is. She asked what kind of tree. He said that was actually a question he'd been trying to figure out. He'd read the program 3 times, and the program wasn't forthcoming on the subject of tree species. And the server said she didn't think school plays were that specific about their trees, that trees in school plays were usually just trees. And the man said, well, he tried to find out what kind because his daughter had told him he needed to know, and he didn't want to fail a quiz about the tree if one materialized. A train moved through the elevated, and the light shifted and came back. His daughter probably didn't actually expect him to know, the server said. He said his daughter had been quizzing him for 2 weeks on her one line and expected him to know it cold by now, so he wasn't making any assumptions about what she expected. What's the line? The server said. He said the 7 words slowly and clearly and then said that she'd corrected his inflection 4 times across approximately 40 run-throughs, so the inflection was also a consideration. Renn drank her coffee. The mug was warm and slightly too heavy, the kind of ceramic that's been through 10 years of a commercial dishwasher and has acquired a surface finish that isn't quite the original. Her eggs were good. White bread toast. He said his daughter had been insisting she wasn't nervous, but her hands had been doing something particular when they drove to school that morning that suggested otherwise. He said he'd thought about saying so and had decided not to. The server said he'd made the right call. He hoped so, he said. His eyes went to his eggs. He was going to try to get out of work an hour early because the play started at 6:30 p.m., and he was not going to be late for the play, regardless of what happened with the job site. He paid at 7:54 a.m. and left. Renn watched him go through the window, walking north, moving at the pace of someone who's behind but not so far behind that rushing will fix it. He stopped at the corner to let a bus pass, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind, and then crossed and was gone. She stayed for a second cup. Outside, the morning was getting fully underway. More people on the sidewalk now, faster moving, the particular body language of people who are already calculating where they need to be in 20 minutes. A produce delivery truck double parked and blocking a lane, a cab going around it with a brief horn. A woman in a red coat walking a small dog that had stopped to be interested in the base of a fire hydrant with a completeness that suggested the walk was not going to be quick. She put $4 on the counter next to the mug and went back to the hotel. She spent the afternoon of day 2 walking without direction. South on Michigan past the river, then west on Wacker through the canyon between the towers, then north along the Chicago River Walk where the water was the color of old pewter, and a tour boat was docked with its canopy down for the season. A man was fishing off the riverwalk with a rod propped against the railing and a thermos open beside him. The likelihood of catching anything in the Chicago River in November wasn't high, but the man had the stillness of someone who was there for the stillness, and the fishing was incidental. She walked past him. She crossed the river at Wells. Fulton Market on a November afternoon had the specific texture of a neighborhood that's been recently turned over for money. The old processing buildings still had their bones, loading docks and freight doors, and the faint industrial smell that no amount of renovation gets completely out of the walls. But the storefronts on the ground floors were wine bars and design studios now. The people on the sidewalk had a different set of clothes than the people who'd worked in those buildings 30 years ago. She walked through it without stopping anywhere and then turned east on Lake and came back north. She was back at the hotel by 5:30 p.m. The hotel restaurant, a burger and a glass of water, table near the back where she could see the room without being visible from the door. A couple near the front window were having the kind of quiet argument where both people are extremely careful with their voices, keeping everything at a register that won't carry. At the next table, a man in his 70s ate alone with a book propped against the salt shaker, not looking up, turning pages the way someone turns pages who has been eating alone with a book for 40 years and has worked out the mechanics. 4 women at a round table near the back were celebrating something, though the thing being celebrated wasn't clear from this distance. She went up to her room at 7:15 p.m. and read 11 pages of the thriller she'd bought at the airport on the way in and set it down. Not because it was bad. The characters were doing things and those things had logic. She just couldn't find the weight of any of it. Day 3 began cold. The temperature had dropped overnight and the sky had the flat white quality that in the Midwest means the next thing could go either way, actual snow or just gray for another 2 weeks. She put on the heavier of the 2 jackets she'd packed and went south to the Art Institute because she'd walked past it twice, and it had a building around it, and the building was free with the card. She paid admission and went in and walked without a map. The first thing she noticed was the specific quality of museum silence, which isn't actually silence but the sound of people deliberately moderating their voices and their footsteps, producing a collective hush that has its own texture. She moved through the European galleries, centuries of them, paintings hung in the specific arrangements that make sense to curators and require some adjustment for everyone else. No placards. She looked at the paintings, moving at an even pace, spending more or less the same amount of time with each one, not because she decided to, but because that was the pace she'd settled into. She spent 40 minutes in the Impressionist galleries. The paintings there had the quality of being interested in light as a subject in itself, rather than as a means to illuminate something else. She found this technically interesting. She looked at several of them for a full minute each and moved on. The Impressionist rooms gave way to a connecting gallery with a skylight, and she stopped for a minute in the middle of it just to stand in the light. The skylight was designed to bring in northern exposure, the flat, even light that doesn't cast harsh shadows, the kind of light that painters of a certain era prized above everything else, It was doing its job. The room was luminous. The paintings had nothing to do with it. A school group moved through in a loose cluster, a teacher saying something at a normal speaking volume that felt loud in the hush. The kids looked at the paintings the way kids look at paintings, which is at varying angles with varying attention, some of them interested and some of them waiting for it to be over. She moved through the Dutch masters, the long room of interior scenes, the Northern European domestic tradition, men with letters and women at windows, and the specific quality of privacy rendered visible. She spent time with two of them. One had a woman reading something at a table near a window with the specific concentrated privacy of someone who doesn't know they're being looked at. The painter had understood that privacy. The painter had also understood the light, the specific quality of Northern European afternoon light coming through glass. In the American galleries on the second floor, she stopped moving for the first time. The room had landscapes from the middle of the 19th century. Large canvases, mostly. Painters who had gone somewhere that felt significant and stood in front of it and tried to put what they saw on a surface that could be carried back. The light in the paintings had a quality she didn't have a precise word for. Present was as close as she could get. The specific warmth of painted air in a painting where the painter was paying attention to the air itself. She moved through the room and then she stopped. It was a landscape. Water, trees, a bank of land in the middle distance, sky above it in the particular colors of late afternoon. The painter was interested in the moment before something changes, not the event, but the held quality of the moment just prior. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides. She stood there for a while. Other visitors passed. Someone's audio guide played a fragment of something and then stopped. A child asked a loud question in the adjacent room and the parent answered in a low voice. The painting didn't do anything except be what it was. She stood in front of it until she'd looked at every part of it, and then she looked at it as a whole again, and then she moved on. She ate in the museum cafe, a chicken sandwich and coffee. A family at the next table had a kid of about 7 who was at the tail end of what had been a longer day than he'd been built for, sitting with his forehead resting on his arms on the table while his parents ate around him. His father had one hand on the kid's back, not rubbing it, just there. She went through the modern wing in the afternoon, and the architectural fragment gallery, and came out the Michigan Avenue entrance at 3:40 p.m. into the wind. She walked north and then cut east on Randolph to the lakefront path, where the wind was substantially worse. The lake was running hard, gray and textured, no boats, the path mostly empty except for a few runners and a man walking a large dog that seemed very pleased about the conditions. She walked north toward Navy Pier, then turned back south when her hands were cold enough, and caught a cab on Ohio Street. The bar on Division Street happened because she'd gone that far north looking for something to eat, and there was a Lebanese place on Wells that had a 45-minute wait, and she wasn't in a mood to wait, and the bar was 2 doors down and had a sight line she liked. Dark wood, 2 TVs above the bar showing a basketball game, neither of which she watched, a good spread between tables. She ordered a beer she didn't finish and sat with it for 90 minutes. A group in the back was celebrating something. Birthday seemed likely. Someone had brought a cake, which was visible for a moment when a server carried it through before the back room door closed again. The birthday person came out twice to use the restroom and moved through the bar with the slightly pained expression of someone who had agreed to this when it was a month away and was now dealing with what that agreement had produced in real time. Both times they stopped at the bar for a minute, leaning on it, not ordering anything, just standing quietly before going back. Renn paid at 9:22 p.m. and walked back to the hotel in the cold. Day 4 she didn't go far and didn't go anywhere with a name. She woke at 6:30 a.m. and lay in bed until 8:00 a.m., not sleeping, which was unusual. The ceiling of this room, unlike the first night's ceiling, had a water stain in the upper left corner. Old, painted over, faintly visible in the morning light in the way that things you've painted over are always faintly visible. She got up and made the hotel room coffee, which required a small pod machine on the bathroom counter, and was noticeably worse than the diner coffee but also did not require putting on shoes. At the desk with the coffee, she looked at the window and the gray sky past it. She opened her laptop, looked at it for a while, and closed it. There was nothing on the laptop that was for her, in the sense of for her specifically as a person with 7 days in Chicago. The laptop had operational software and documentation, and the particular absence of anything personal that had always characterized it, that she'd never found a reason to change. At 10:00 a.m., she put her jacket on and walked south through the Loop, no destination. The Loop on a Wednesday morning had the specific operational rhythm of a place that exists for work and knows it. Everyone moving with purpose toward buildings. The sidewalks full of people who had somewhere to be in the next 15 minutes and knew exactly how long it would take. She was the only person she could identify who was walking without any particular direction, which gave the whole thing an odd quality, like being the only person at a train station who wasn't catching a train. She bought coffee from a cart near the Chicago Board of Trade building. The building's facade had the carved figures she'd read about once somewhere, Roman goddesses, Ceres at the top holding grain, the old symbols of commerce executed in limestone in 1930. She drank the coffee standing on the sidewalk looking up at it for a few minutes. The figures were worn at the details, time and weather and the specific acid of urban air. The face of the top figure had lost its specificity, the features present but softened, generic now where they'd once been particular. Still, they're but not quite what they'd been. She crossed LaSalle and went west on Jackson past the Federal Building and the post office, the specific institutional weight of those structures, the granite and the setbacks, buildings designed to communicate permanence to the people who had to come to them. She turned north on Canal and walked back east on Madison, which took her through the part of the Loop that isn't the finance district, the county buildings and the legal services offices and the bail bondsmen and the coffee shops that exist because the county buildings and legal services offices create a particular kind of foot traffic, different texture from the finance end, more waiting, more people who are there because the system requires them to be. She turned east on Madison and came back to Michigan Avenue. She turned east on Jackson and walked toward the lake. The wind came stronger as she got clear of the building mass, and she tucked her chin against it and kept moving. Michigan Avenue south of the Loop had the specific energy of a retail corridor that's been through multiple cycles of investment and neglect, flagship stores and shuttered storefronts alternating, the whole stretch in the process of being something different from what it recently was. She walked 3 blocks north and then went into a diner she hadn't been to before, a smaller place on Michigan with 6 tables and a counter, and drank coffee and read the Tribune somebody had left on the counter. The sports section had analysis of a team that had been eliminated from playoff contention. The city section had a piece about the Chicago Architecture Foundation's holiday programming. She read both without particular investment. She ate at a Thai place on Adams Street. Green curry, rice, tea. The lunch rush was on, and the place was full, and the servers were moving fast with the practiced efficiency of a kitchen that does this volume every day. She ate at the bar counter in the front window and watched Adams Street and then paid and walked back north. She came back to the diner on Wabash at 3:00 p.m., which was not when she'd been coming, but it was there and she wanted the coffee. The afternoon configuration was different from the morning, quieter. 2 tables occupied by people who had stepped away from wherever they'd been, the counter empty except for her. The afternoon server was younger than the morning server, faster moving, brought the coffee without the morning server's unhurried precision. Renn drank it and watched the street in the lower light of November afternoon, the elevated putting its shadow across the sidewalk, cutting the already thin sunlight nearly in half. A woman on the sidewalk was struggling with an umbrella in the wind, trying to get it inside out and back again while walking, and it was not going well. She came back to the hotel at 4:15 p.m. The television went on. She went through the channels and found a nature documentary, the specific ones that narrate the African plains with measured authority. A pride of lions in the heat of the day, doing nothing with such commitment that it became its own subject. The narrator explained the energy economics of it. A predator at the top of the food chain has solved the problem of finding food well enough that the main constraint is energy efficiency. Movement is expensive. Waiting isn't. The prey will still be there in the evening. She watched the lions rest, their breathing visible in the heat shimmer, their tails moving occasionally. The the size of them more apparent when they were still. The thing she'd been sitting with since Tuesday afternoon, since the White Room in Arlington and the exit protocol and the cab to Dulles, was the absence of the next thing. She'd been given 7 days with no next thing visible from where she was standing, and the absence had a texture she kept running into from different angles. Not distress, something quieter and more structural, like reaching for something that's always been in a particular place and finding the place empty. She kept finding the edge of it the way you keep finding a gap where a tooth used to be, not because it's distressing but because it's there. She had no one to call. This wasn't new, but the knowing had a different quality in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon in a hotel room than it did when she was between assignments and the operational structure was still present. Here, the channels existed for one purpose, and she wasn't doing that purpose. The personal phone she'd had during the long cover in 2017 and 2018 had been a Chicago number as it happened. She'd let it lapse when the assignment closed. She hadn't thought about it in years. She looked at the window. The sky was the same gray it had been all morning. The documentary moved from the lions to a sequence about elephants at a water source. The elephants were moving through territory they knew, taking what they needed, carrying years of accumulated information about where the water was and where the grass was, older animals leading, the knowledge of the land encoded in the herd and passed down through years of proximity to it. She fell asleep in the chair at around 4:30 p.m. and woke at 7:52 p.m. with a stiff neck and the television still running and the room dark except for the screen. She ordered room service, ate it, watched the second half of the documentary, in which a younger elephant had a problem that was resolved with intervention from the rest of the herd. She was in bed by 10:00 p.m. day 5. She was on Michigan Avenue at 11:23 a.m. The day was clear but cold, the sky a hard pale blue with no warmth in it, the kind of late autumn day where the light is bright and does nothing to the temperature. The shop windows along this stretch of Michigan caught reflections cleanly in afternoon light, but in the late morning, with the sun behind the buildings to the east, the reflections were softer, present enough to be useful. She wasn't scanning. She hadn't been scanning for any of the last 4 days, because there'd been nothing to scan for, which was itself an unusual condition. Her eyes did what her eyes always did in a street environment, which was process the full frame rather than any specific part of it, the background running continuously the way it had always run since her early training in a warehouse in Fairfax, with a woman named Geller who had told her on the first day that the problem with surveillance awareness training is that it teaches you to be suspicious of the wrong specific things and stops you from being suspicious of everything at once. She was not suspicious of anything at 11:23 a.m. She was walking north on Michigan with no destination. The figure was behind her and across the street by roughly 40 meters. Dark coat, wool, the heavier movement of a real wool coat rather than synthetic, which registered peripherally the way material quality registers when you've spent enough years watching people move. Medium height. The figure was walking at a pace that tracked hers without being obviously calibrated to it, which required more precision than obvious calibration, which was itself a thing to notice. She continued walking, pace unchanged, direction unchanged. The window of a luggage store gave her 2 seconds of reflection. She acquired the position, acquired the gait, filed both. At a coffee cart on the corner of Michigan and Erie, she stopped and waited in a short line. The figure didn't stop. The figure continued north past her position at the same pace, crossed Erie, continued north. She got her coffee and turned south on Michigan, which reversed the geometry. In the first 50 meters, she confirmed the figure wasn't following the reversal. Patient surveillance with enough resources doesn't reverse with the target, it hands off. She was being watched by something that either had enough reach to hand off or had known she would reverse and had positioned accordingly. She continued south. The coffee was hot. She drank it and watched the street and the reflections and felt the cold and filed what she'd confirmed. 40 minutes later, she was approaching the Art Institute from the south, moving along the main Michigan Avenue facade toward the main entrance stairs, and the figure was on the southeast corner of Michigan and Monroe. Different position from the earlier sighting. Shifted east. Farther now than the first observation, and the intervening angle was not a straight line from the first position, which ruled out coincidental movement along the same route. Somebody had moved to maintain observation while changing geometry, which was the correct technique, and the gap between the two sightings was long enough to be professionally defensible. The surveillance was skilled. She went up the stairs and through the entrance and got her card out for the desk without looking back. Inside, in the first gallery, she stood in front of a painting she'd already spent time with on day 3 and looked at it without seeing it and ran what she had. Not hyped. She knew what ICD surveillance on herself felt like. It happened to all senior investigators on a rotating basis, and the methodology had a specific signature, a house style that was recognizable once you'd been through it. Not any American service she'd been briefed on, not any European service. The methods were close to human surveillance doctrine, close enough that whoever was running this had studied how human services operated, had absorbed the manual completely. Positioning textbook, timing textbook. The geometry on the Monroe Street corner was exactly correct for maintaining observation after a reversal, but there was a calibration issue, not in the geometry, in the quality of the stillness. Human surveillance operatives hold still when they are waiting, but the stillness has a particular character, suppressed readiness, muscles engaged at low level, the body doing something even in its pauses. A person waiting at a street corner looks like someone waiting at a street corner. They shift their weight. They check their phone or don't. A body at a lower level of operational activity, but not at zero. She'd seen a lot of people holding still in a lot of contexts, and she knew what that looked like from 40 meters in a shop window reflection. The figure on the Monroe Street corner hadn't had that character. The figure had been still without the quality of something suppressed underneath it. Still the way something is still when stillness is the default state rather than an active choice. The difference was the kind of thing you could see and not be able to explain immediately, and she was still not able to explain it, but she'd looked at it from 3 angles in the last 40 minutes and the result was the same each time. She stood in front of the painting for 4 minutes. Then she moved on through the gallery. She walked the museum for an hour. She came out the Monroe Street entrance at 1:17 p.m. Instead of the Michigan Avenue entrance, walked west to State, south on State, east on Jackson, north on Michigan. By the time she reached the hotel, there was no sign of the figure in any direction behind her or ahead of her. She noted this, filed it. She wasn't going to report it, which was also a thing to file. The not reporting was not carelessness. She had no evidence that would survive a reporting threshold. What she had was a reflection in a window, a figure on a corner, and a quality of stillness she didn't have a category for. She'd seen surveillance operatives before. She'd run surveillance operatives before. She had the full ICD methodology file, every service they'd mapped in 40 years of intelligence work. Nothing in those files matched what she'd seen. That gap was the thing. She put it in the same place she kept the gradient file from the Far Side station. The same place she kept Ibarra's list. A drawer that was filling up with things that didn't fit the taxonomy she'd been given and that she wasn't reporting. She went to the movie theater on Michigan Avenue at 4:00 p.m., a film she hadn't heard of. She sat in the back third of the theater in an aisle seat and watched it for 2 hours. The film was about a family and a house and a decision made years earlier that was arriving in the present. The performances were good. She watched the images and let the plot move without following it carefully. She left before the credits and ate at a counter pizza place on Ontario Street, one slice standing up, and was back in the room by 7:15 p.m. Day 6 came in gray. She woke at 6:44 a.m. The sky through the window gap had the flat, colorless quality that in the Great Lakes region means the atmosphere is holding something. She got up and made the hotel room coffee and sat at the desk. She took the photograph out of her jacket pocket. It had been in the inside left breast pocket since the cab outside Brennan's apartment in Detroit 3 months ago. She'd moved it from jacket to jacket as she moved through assignments. It lived in the inside left pocket because that was where she'd first put it in that cab and the position had become its position. During the subsequent assignments, Arlington, the Far Side station, Arlington again, she'd been aware of it the way you're aware of a transit card or a house key, functionally and without examination. She set it on the desk in front of her. The photograph was 5 by 7, printed on matte paper. A family portrait, the coordinated outfit variety. All three subjects in burgundy, which suggested a deliberate decision made for this specific photograph and probably not repeated. A porch behind them, autumn foliage, the specific light of a late afternoon in October. The woman on the left was smiling. Full face in it, the kind of smile where you can tell the impulse behind it is real and uncomplicated. She was in her early 40s, hair pulled back, not posing but present. Renn had looked at the photograph several times since Detroit and had registered the smile as a data point, genuine, unperformed. The specific facial configuration of someone who is actually happy in the moment the shutter opens. This morning she looked at it longer. She looked at the woman's eyes. The eyes were doing the same thing the mouth was doing, the full-face quality of it, the alignment of the expression across all features simultaneously, which is something you can manufacture in a rehearsed way and something else entirely when it's just happening to someone. The teenager in the middle had crossed her eyes and had her tongue at the corner of her mouth, the deliberate comedy of a 15-year-old who doesn't want to be in a family portrait and is making sure everyone knows it. Burgundy outfit still on, because the outfit was the deal, but the face was not part of any deal. The girl's face under the deliberately stupid expression was doing more than one thing, something doing more than one thing at once. The joke and underneath the joke the affection, both present simultaneously. The kid making the face at the camera and also knowing her mother was beside her and being glad about that. Brennan was on the right, standing slightly apart in the way she'd noted in the cab in Detroit. An inch and a half of space between him and his family. She'd categorized this initially as a posture data point, consistent with the operational file she'd built on him. This morning, looking at him in the gray Chicago light, she looked at it differently. The space wasn't estrangement. It was more like the specific position of someone who doesn't entirely know what to do with his body inside a happy moment, who is glad to be there, and uncertain how to hold the gladness. He was smiling, but the smile was working harder than the woman's smile. His hands were at his sides, not clasped, not in pockets. At his sides, fingers slightly curved, the posture of someone who is trying and mostly succeeding and knows there's a gap between the two. She looked at all three of them for a while. Then she put the photograph back in the inside pocket. She got dressed and went out. She walked north along Michigan and then through Streeterville and north along Clark into Lincoln Park. The neighborhood had the weekday residential quiet of a place that empties out during work hours. Dog walkers, the occasional stroller, a woman sweeping her front steps in a coat over pajama pants, a man in a work van eating lunch in the cab with the radio audible from the sidewalk. The trees in Lincoln Park were mostly bare. A few held their last leaves, brown and persistent, the leaves that had decided to wait. The bookstore on Clark was a used bookstore, 2 floors, the organization system of a place that had been accumulating inventory for decades and had its own internal logic. The store smelled like paper and something under the paper. She spent 35 minutes in it, moving through the aisles without a specific target. She pulled a book off a shelf in the history section, because the cover photograph showed a man standing at a surveying instrument on a high ridge with nothing visible in any direction, and the scale of the emptiness around him was specific and verifiable. History of the triangulation surveys of the American West. Men with instruments and mules, working their way across geography that had never been mapped, establishing fixed points from which everything else could be measured. She read the back copy and the first page and put it under her arm. In the fiction section, she found a novel she'd heard of sometime in the mid-2000s and never read. Short, under 200 pages. She read the first paragraph standing in the aisle. The voice was doing something she could follow. She paid $12 for both. She stopped for coffee on Armitage at a place with tables in the window. Sat with the coffee and watched the street for 40 minutes. A woman with a stroller was having an argument with someone on her phone, keeping her voice controlled in the specific way of someone who is angry and also in public, and not willing to give the public the full version. 2 men from a moving company were carrying a large sofa up an exterior staircase on the building across the street, navigating it around a banister with the practiced efficiency of people who move furniture in tight spaces every day. No wasted words. a system. A small dog at the end of its leash had gotten the leash wrapped twice around the base of a parking meter and was sitting with the resigned patience of an animal that has run out of ideas and is waiting for the situation to resolve from outside. She walked back south to the hotel and packed that evening. Her bag had never fully come unpacked. She folded what needed folding. The 2 books went on the desk and she looked at them and then packed them too. The bag went by the door. She sat at the window for an hour watching the city at night. The elevated ran. Michigan Avenue moved. Somewhere across the city, in some school gymnasium that was by now finished and emptied and dark, a man in a work jacket had not been late for the play. She went to bed at 10:30 p.m., day 7. She was at the front desk at 7:00 a.m. sharp. She settled the bill in cash, and the agent said she hoped the stay had been enjoyable, and Renn said it had been fine, which was accurate. She went through the revolving door into the early morning cold. The cab to O'Hare took 38 minutes in light early traffic. She watched the city move past, and then the expressway take over, and then the flat-ordered geometry of the approach roads, the cargo terminals, the runways visible behind chain link. O'Hare at 8:20 a.m. on a Wednesday. She moved through security in 11 minutes. Terminal 3, Gate H14, departure at 10:15 a.m. to Reagan National. She bought coffee from a cart near the gate and sat in the row of seats facing the windows. Her gate was on the east side of the terminal, and the windows faced the runways, the flat Illinois sky beyond them pale and clear, the sun still low enough to put the morning at an angle. Ground vehicles moved around the planes in the organized purposefulness of airport operations, everything with a function, everything coordinated. Around her, the departure lounge was doing what departure lounges do. A family with 2 kids, one of them old enough to manage the waiting and one not, the younger one cycling through the complete range of restlessness options at roughly 2-minute intervals. A businessman in a window seat working a laptop with the focused intensity of someone who has 3 hours to make a dent in something. 2 women at the gate counter asking about upgrades. An older man asleep in the middle row of seats with his coat folded over him. Not the sleep of someone who's been awake all night, just the practiced sleep of someone who's traveled enough to sleep in departure, lounges the way other people sleep in beds. She watched the family. The mother was managing both kids and a rolling suitcase and a bag of airport food, and doing all of this simultaneously, with the efficiency of someone who has given up on the idea that any of these things will happen in sequence. Her older kid sat against the window with headphones on, looking at a phone, performing the indifference of a 12-year-old who is too old for the airport to be interesting, and not old enough to have anywhere better to be. Down the row, the younger one found the power outlet at the base of the wall and became fixated on it for a full 4 minutes. Then the kid stood up and went to the mother and said something, and the mother said something back, and the kid sat down again. She drank her coffee and thought about the figure in the dark wool coat. Not Ike, not any human service she had a file on. The methodology was derived from human practice, absorbed, studied, applied correctly in terms of geometry and timing. But the stillness had been wrong. Wrong in a specific way she didn't have a category for yet. She'd been adding to a drawer for the last 3 months, the gradient file from the Far Side Station, Ibarra's list, the moment she put the photograph on Ibarra's desk and then picked it back up. The figure on the Monroe Street corner went into the same drawer. She didn't know what the drawer was for. The keeping was its own kind of data. She wasn't going to report it. Confirmed. She boarded at 9:40 a.m., aisle seat, always the aisle. The window seat in her row stayed empty. She put her bag in the overhead and sat and put her hands in her lap. They pushed back at 10:09 a.m. Announcements ran. The plane taxied north, waited, turned onto the active runway. The engines changed register and the ground started moving. They lifted at 10:22 a.m. She didn't look out the window. The city was below somewhere to the left for a moment, and then they were in cloud, and then above it, the overcast a gray-white floor, the upper atmosphere clear and cold and blue. Somewhere over Indiana, the altitude leveled into cruise, and she understood what the 7 days had been. The understanding wasn't a revelation. It was the specific quality of confirming something that has been true for a while, and that you've been in proximity to without quite making contact with. She'd moved through 7 days in Chicago the way she moved through everything, efficiently, observationally, filing what she encountered including herself. Walked and eaten and listened to a man talk about his daughter. Stood in front of a painting for a while and moved on. Noticed a watcher and processed it and filed it and continued her day. She'd looked at a photograph for longer than she'd looked at it before. 2 books bought and not read. The person who could have done those things differently she couldn't locate from where she was sitting. It had happened over a long time. The work taking up the space where other things had been. The work what was there when she reached. And eventually the only thing she reached for. She didn't think the person was gone. The person was at a distance she no longer knew how to cross. She put it away the way she put everything away, into the same drawer as everything else, the drawer that kept filling. And she noted with a precision she couldn't help that the drawer was getting heavy, and she still didn't know what it was for. She reached up and got the bag from the overhead and took out the surveying book and opened to the first chapter. The triangulation surveys of the 1840s and 1850s. Men with instruments and mules, establishing fixed points from which everything else could be measured, working their way across geography that had never been mapped, standing at the instrument with nothing in any direction. She read with comprehension and without engagement. They began the descent into Reagan National at 11:30 a.m. She put the book away. Her operational phone had been off since Tuesday morning. She turned it on. One message. Sent that morning at 6:00 a.m. A briefing header. A date 4 days out. A single line of operational text below it. She read the briefing header. She read the operational line twice, which was her habit with operational lines. The assignment had a name. It had a location. It had the specific density of a briefing line that is a summary of something larger she'd be read in on arrival. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the seat back in front of her, while the plane made its final approach over the Potomac. The wheels touched at 11:52 a.m. She waited in her seat while the rows ahead of her cleared, because she always waited. When it was her turn, she stood and took her bag from the overhead and moved up the aisle, through the door, through the jetway, into the terminal, through the terminal and out into the cold of the DC afternoon. A cab at the curb. She got in, gave the address, which was not her address because she didn't have an address, but it was the address she gave cabs leaving Reagan National, a building in Foggy Bottom where she could check her equipment and pick up the reading documentation and be where she needed to be before the briefing. The cab pulled onto the George Washington Parkway, the Potomac on the left, cold and brown, the Virginia shore, the DC shore, a talk station on low, voices discussing something with the urgent cadence of people paid to seem concerned. The sky over the district was lower than Chicago's sky, the cloud ceiling different, the particular gray of the East Coast fall rather than the flat Midwest gray she'd been looking at for 7 days. She had 4 days until the assignment. The briefing was probably tomorrow. She'd read in, she'd build the file, she'd map the operational parameters and the contingencies and the close. The work would reassemble itself around her the way it always did, the structure returning, the next thing becoming visible, the shape of what needed doing filling the space where the 7 days in Chicago had been. The cab moved through the Foggy Bottom traffic, and she sat in the back with the photograph in the inside left pocket and the phone in the right outer pocket and the surveying book in the bag at her feet and the 7 days behind her at whatever distance things go when you file them. She was already working. She'd probably been working since somewhere over Indiana, if she was being precise about it, which she was. The cab stopped at the address. She paid in cash and got out into the DC cold and went in.